Dan had been saying to them and to several of his friends that he might leave Ukraine, he might go and work for a humanitarian organisation in India, he might reconstitute Dark Angels as a medevac organisation, or to some of his friends here and the foreign fighters that he was hanging out with, that he would actually join a foreign fighter unit. He wanted to join the 78th Gertz Regiment in Zaporizhzhia. It seems. I think also it is clear that Dan was, didn't quite know what he wanted to do at this point in his life. He had, obviously slightly traumatized. His friends describe him mostly with affection, some very critical of him, as in quite a chaotic space in his life. Not quite certain what he wanted to do. And Ukraine's quite a dangerous place as it is out in the east. But if you're out there and you're not quite certain what it is you want to do, as one foreign fighter said to me, he spoke of Dan with great affection. He said, "Don't come to Ukraine uncertain as to what it is you want to do, because you start attracting bad people around you."
Fighting in Ukraine appears to have ended after Ukrainian police found a body in Zaporizhzhia. It represents a breakthrough in the search for Daniel Burke, a 36-year-old who was last seen in August, but it's still devastating news for his family. Well, Anthony Loyd, the Times special correspondent, has been speaking with them and has written about this in today's Times. He joins us now live from Kyiv. Morning, Anthony.
Good morning.
So first of all, tell us about, Daniel Burke himself. Why was he in Ukraine? What's his background?
So Daniel Burke was a former paratrooper. He joined the army in 2007. He did a tour of Afghanistan, left afterwards. He was discharged from the army. Later in life, he joined the YPG, the Kurds in northeastern Syria, who are fighting against Islamic State. Then after the war in Ukraine began, he came here last year and set up a group of foreign fighters, a fairly small group, called the Dark Angels, who were involved in some action against the Russians last summer and autumn. Daniel went back to the UK for a break. He returned to Ukraine this year, uncertain as to whether he wanted to become a fighter again, a volunteer fighter, or whether he wanted to reconstitute Dark Angels, that by that stage disbanded, as a kind of medevac group to evacuate or get wounded people out of frontline areas. During that time and recently, he began to hang out with more foreign fighters. He was also telling friends that he was going to go into the kind of aid world, humanitarian world. He still had a lot of his original cash lines, which are used by foreign fighters here to support themselves and to arm and equip themselves. During this time, about a month ago, he went missing on Friday, August the 11th. He was last seen in the company of another foreign fighter, an Australian. CCTV picks him up leaving Zaporizhzhia. This isn't the front line, it's relatively near, about 30 miles away, leaving his apartment in a vehicle, Mitsubishi. They drive together out of the city, and a few hours later, the car returns with the Australian driving it and no sign of Dan. The Australian fighter did say, and I've interviewed him, that no, Dan was there. He had food poisoning, which actually Dan did often get, and was lying on the back seat. And the Australian denies any involvement in Dan's disappearance. He went missing. The police search started. That was a month ago. And yesterday, the police announced that they had found a body of a man that they believe is Dan, but pending forensic tests, in the area of their search at the edge of Zaporizhzhia.
And is it clear, is there any sense of what happened to him?
No, but it is a murder investigation now. It's not a missing persons, it's a murder investigation. So one imagines by that the logical thing is the body had evidence of having died violently.
And this is, the worst news for his family, who've obviously been incredibly worried about him in the intervening period. What did they say to you?
Well, one thing that was immediately apparent, which was very surprising to me, is despite the millions and millions of aid and weaponry and support that Britain has given to Ukraine, there was no police liaison officer at any stage that was attached to the embassy or put in touch with the British embassy in Kyiv to update the family on what was going on over the past month. So they were entirely in the dark, really, about what has been happening, about any likely leads or any breakthroughs, and we're really having to ring around people who are in Zaporizhzhia themselves or journalists who went there to try and find out what was going on. And in fact, it wasn't the Foreign Office that broke the news to them. I think the police told journalists yesterday before they told the Foreign Office or British Embassy. So it's been very isolating, very frightening experience to the family. And then you've got this second level of it, which is during all this, it was confirmed that a second British fighter who had died in Ukraine, Jordan Chadwick, known as Joe Chadwick, had in fact, it seems, been killed by members of his own team. His body was found in June, but not repatriated until last month. Now it turns out that his hands were tied and he had been drowned, not by Russians, but it seems by members of his own team.
I mean, just give us an insight as much as you can, Anthony, into how these groups operate. I mean, you talk there about Jordan Chadwick, and that's just horrendous that he's been killed by someone in his own team. You talked about how Daniel had gone to set up this own unit. I mean, how do they operate in Ukraine? How do they get the funding? What are the sort of people who are attracted to that kind of work?
So there's different levels, and there's a pretty broad spectrum of individuals attached to this line of work. In fairness, I have met a few who seem to be very experienced, both in their previous military experience elsewhere. Could have been with regular or special forces somewhere else, or it could have been as a civilian who gained experience fighting in somewhere like Syria. So quite a lot of them do bring experience to the table in Ukraine. Some don't. Some haven't got any clue at all. But of those who are experienced, who really has something to offer, who will allow themselves to be contracted to the Ukrainian army, will allow themselves to go through the vetting procedure, and will enter a disciplined unit. Well, not very many of them. You find a few individuals, usually you can pick who's been here a long time, who speaks Ukrainian, who has an understanding really of the background to the war and why they're here, as to who might be a professional soldier. But there's an awful lot of people, a really ugly mix of guns, violence, sometimes quite psychotic individuals, often very traumatized individuals. I think there's rather a glorious image to this at home. The reality is extremely dangerous, febrile, and often quite squalid. There's two basic types of unit. There are the units some foreign fighters join where they are contracted officially to the Ukrainian army. It's quite a lengthy and actually bureaucratic process. And then there are some units, it was more last year that this was possible, who could kind of form up and have a loose alliance to the Ukrainian army. Dark Angels was one of those that Dan set up. They were never formally contracted to the Ukrainian army. And they fell apart amongst some dispute amongst themselves, not really heated dispute, but some of them wanted to be contracted to the Ukrainian army and do more, some didn't, and that's how they fell apart. We don't think that's the reasons behind Dan's death. As for the funding, excuse me, once you're contracted, you get paid by the Ukrainian army. However, it's very interesting that some of these Ukrainian units will really only have foreign fighters or foreign fighter groups attached to them, give them license to operate with them, if they can either semi-fund themselves or bring in good funding lines for drones and equipment and all the rest of it. So there are these various kind of online platforms, such as Ghost Concept, which Dan used quite a lot, Dan Burke used quite a lot, which match foreign fighters over here with donors abroad, often for a huge amount of money. And that's often where a lot of the problem comes in these internal disputes. A lot of money swashing around, a lot of guns, a lot of violent guys, mix it up with alcohol and a bit of trauma. Things go wrong fast.
Mm. You mentioned that Daniel Burke had been fighting for the YPG forces in Syria, and in fact he went to Wandsworth Prison, didn't he, as a result of that, because the government, was not supporting people going over. Is that different for Ukraine because there is government support? What's the government line on former British fighters, or indeed anyone going over and fighting in Ukraine?
Really good question. Totally different scenario. Dan went, I think he did 9 months in Wandsworth Prison on remand, waiting to see if the CPS were actually going to bring terror charges against them, which the police had intimated they would. That experience was very common for British fighters who had volunteered, gone off, joined the Kurds, fought against Islamic State. And it was part of quite a kind of flick-flat policy that Britain's got with Turkey, its relationships with Turkey and Turkey's, antipathy towards the Kurds. Dan was never sentenced. He was released. Here, it's totally the opposite. No one's ever put on trial for coming out to Ukraine to serve. And in fact, I'd say it's encouraged. It's actually encouraged for former servicemen to come over here and join the Ukrainian army. It's not something they'll ever face prosecution for when they go home.
Gosh. And how, speaking to Dan's family, how did they feel about him? He'd obviously fought in conflicts around the world. How did they feel about him being in Ukraine?
As far as I understand, this is conversations just I've had over the last 2 or 3 days. up until including yesterday, they were proud of Dan and they were concerned for Dan. Those two things. Yeah, I think they're proud of his work. They were concerned where that might lead, but also Dan had been saying to them and to several of his friends that he might leave Ukraine. He might go and work for a humanitarian organisation in India. He might reconstitute Dark Angels as a medevac organisation, or to some of his friends here and the foreign fighters that he was hanging out with, that he would actually join a foreign fighter unit. He wanted to join the 78th Gertz Regiment in Zaporizhzhia. It seems. I think also it is clear that Dan was, didn't quite know what he wanted to do at this point in his life. He had, obviously slightly traumatized. His friends describe him mostly with affection, some very critical of him, as in quite a chaotic space in his life. Not quite certain what he wanted to do. And Ukraine's quite a dangerous place as it is out in the east. But if you're out there and you're not quite certain what it is you want to do, as one foreign fighter said to me, he spoke of Dan with great affection. He said, "Don't come to Ukraine uncertain as to what it is you want to do, because you start attracting bad people around you."
Gosh, Anthony, thank you so much for bringing that story to us. Really grateful to you.
Thank you.
That is Anthony Loyd, the Times special correspondent.